Hi, how you going? So this is going to be a video series that I'm going to start where I'm talking about general things that I think about art and things about learning, the mental game behind art, all these sort of things. Because when we're talking about high-level illustration and working in technical art fields and all these sort of things, there's a lot that actually really goes on in somebody's mind and that you have to learn about that's outside of the specific techniques that you use to get good. Everyone focuses on the fundamentals and they're all really important. But the conversations that I'm more interested in are what is the mental game behind things. So let's say you have motivation in spades. You actually already have that. So most people struggle with motivation, but there is actually levels past that. And I'm not really going to talk about motivation too much in these videos because there's so many amazing people out there that are really good at motivating. Bobby Chu is probably the main one which comes to mind, Proco, all these sort of other great YouTube channels that are about motivation and the actual specific techniques. But I want to start filling in a different niche. And so today's topic I'm going to talk about is really teachers. And we're going to talk about teachers in this sort of meta aspect. What does a teacher mean when we're talking about illustration and learning these certain skill sets? So what is the fundamental difference between having a teacher versus teaching yourself to do something? And we can really dive into this by considering that in the modern world, the actual person who is teaching themselves usually has access to better information than what a teacher is able to give out by themselves. But the thing is that all that information is uncurated. And when you're a beginner, you probably actually don't know what's the right information to go for. So there's a lot of interesting things here. What is the value of a teacher when they don't have better information than what a self-taught person has? And there's a few different ways that I break this down. So the first is that the information that they're going to give you is going to be tailored specifically to where you are at a specific point in time. And that's something that you can do yourself if you're very well prepared and understand the journey that you're going to do. But a teacher, if they're really good, should be able to actually have that correct information that's the right thing for you at that right time. Now, the other thing that I think is more profound and good to talk about is what is it that a teacher can see that you cannot see? When you show your work to an art teacher and they point out specific things that you actually didn't know you were doing wrong or pointed out something about your work that you didn't realize. And it's this thing about tacit skill where anyone who's actually been doing something for a long time has a perception about certain aspects of what they're doing that the beginner just doesn't have any access to. And perception being, in this context, the ability to derive meaning out of a noisy signal. So we're looking at a piece of art and as someone who knows how to draw in perspective really well, they're going to be pick up on perspective issues in a much more subtle way than a beginner who won't have had that yet. And so when you're a beginner, you're trying to work out how do you get that perception into your brain. Knowing how to draw a good perspective, that's important. You need to know the theory there. But the ability to look at something and instantly know that it's off and why it's off and how it's off is actually what you need to improve it. Because it doesn't matter if you can draw a perfect 3-point box in perspective. If you can't see the issues in a full scene and can't pick up on them and can't fix them. And it has to happen like really snappy and in real time for you to be able to do it while you're working and being productive. And so the way which I think about a teacher's playing into this is that you are really borrowing their perception for the time that they have them. Because they have a much more heightened perception for certain issues. And while they don't have more information than the internet, and they might not have the best information out there, what they certainly do have is a better perception of the issues that you need to learn than you do. And so when they're given this critique, they're getting that little piece of perception out of their brain, and they're putting it into yours. And for a second, you can actually see more than what you were able to do before. Now, this is not to say that a teacher is the only way to gain this extra perception. It is just the most reliable and easiest way. And that if you are self-taught, you actually need to think of strategies of how do you increase this perception to begin with. Because here's the trick. You can't perceive what you don't yet know you want to be able to perceive. You might think to yourself, I want to be able to see these perspective errors, but a lot of people aren't even aware that improvement is related to increasing this perception. And it's just this sort of magical, mythical thing where if you draw enough, you get better. But it's not quite that simple. It's really that you improve by increasing the amount of knowledge you have, increasing your perception, increasing your visual library, simply having better thoughts about how to do this, connecting things that are usually unrelated in most people's brains and making really fast, snappy connections that you can actually draw from when you are drawing. So I think what this comes down to is, what I want you to take away from this video is recognize that in your art journey, there are going to be there's so much that you cannot yet perceive about your work. You might think to yourself, I can see all mistakes. You probably can't. And that's not to say that you're bad or that's a special thing. That's how everybody is. If you haven't drawn something enough or you haven't done something in any skill enough, you won't be able to perceive it. And so if you come into it going, there is things that are outside of my grasp at this current moment, but I want to develop strategies so that you can actually grasp them in the future, you're going to have a much better chance of success than if you're not having some sort of plan. If you are just doing random studies and going ahead, you're not going to get there. So how do you start to get this perception? And what is the rules for a good study that's going to get you there? And I think there's a couple of different rules about what a study needs to be in order to get there. A study can only really increase your perception if you have a metric which you're measuring against. Because the brain is really, really good at comparisons. And when we focus on something very specifically, we can perceive more about that specific thing than what we could do just casually looking at something. So if you were copying something and having that exact thing, having to match it exactly is going to heighten your perception on distance-based measurements, angle-based measurements, color, value, all these sort of things. Because you have a metric to measure against, and you're constantly correcting the mistakes that you did from while you're going. And that constant correction of mistakes against a known point is what is increasing the perception there. That's a very simple case. But when you get into something, let's say, full scene perspective, it's just a really easy example to go into. One thing which I get people to do there is I get them to draw over a 3D generated line art environment. So it might just be a room of couches and all that sort of thing. And people who can't draw perspective actually do a lot better at that exercise than they realize they're going to. And that's because the brain is really good at seeing 3D spaces and seeing when something is off. So if you were to draw characters in a 3D scene that is perfectly drawn perspective-wise, you're going to have a much better chance of success than you will otherwise if you're drawing in a white canvas. Because on the white canvas, you have nothing to compare it to. You don't have anything to train that sort of perception. So when you train with that way of checking it and letting your brain latch onto these perception mechanisms, you're going to do a lot better. And while I'm giving some very specific examples, really what I want you to take home here is that a study is going to be most effective if you have some way of checking it. Because when you start getting to the harder and harder exercises, it's going to get harder to work out these checking mechanisms. So you better have actually developed this perception in the simple cases where you can check it. Anyhow, I think that's enough thoughts for today, and I'm going to try and keep these up bi-weekly sort of thing. It might be a bit irregular, but hope those are some good thoughts. Hope you have a wonderful day and make some lovely art. Bye.